Hi, welcome to LinkedIn News Live, a show about the world of work and our place in it. We are entering the fifth day of the conflict in Ukraine, and the US and EU have imposed more economic sanctions on Russia, targeting the country's central bank and currency. Companies and investors are also exiting Russia, such as BP and Norway's sovereign wealth fund. Meanwhile, talks between Russia and Ukraine ended with a promise to have more talks. Joining me now to unpack the geopolitical and economic ramifications of all this is Maziar Minovi. He is the CEO of Eurasia Group. Prior to that, he was the managing director at Goldman Sachs, where for over 12 years, he advised clients on political risk. He was also an economist at the IMF. He received his MBA and PhD from the George Washington University School of Business. Maziar, welcome.
Thank you, Nina. Happy to be here.
So glad to have you on the show and letting us pick your brain. Just for starters, why Ukraine and why now?
Well, those questions are easy to answer, and I will. The bigger question is why to this extent, which I'm sure we'll get into. But why Ukraine and why now? We have a president of Russia, Putin, who is at the same time extremely uncomfortable with the geopolitical status quo, and also sees a unique opportunity to take advantage of it. What do I mean? In terms of the opportunities, we had a Germany without Chancellor Merkel, which towered over the foreign policy of Europe for decades and had the respect of Putin. We have a France increasingly trying to disentangle from the US with a push for strategic autonomy, having been annoyed together with the rest of Europe about how the US handled the weapons sales, submarine sales to Australia, and a few other matters. We have a US that, in Putin's estimation, is disentangling from global affairs, be it the withdrawal from Afghanistan, or its pivot to Asia, or the fraying of relationships with the Arab countries in the Persian Gulf. Putin certainly saw opportunities there. And he also felt confident economically. It spent the 7 years since taking over Crimea, building up his war chest, actually been quite fiscally responsible. So he saw the opportunities. What about the threats? He really considers himself encircled. First of all, in Ukraine, he thought that when President Zelensky came to power, he'd be someone that'd be pragmatic and would focus domestically on building up Ukraine's economy. To his surprise, Zelensky's been shifting towards the West and trying to integrate Ukraine more into Europe and NATO. NATO itself is a constant thorn in his side, and the encroachment of NATO taking over all of the Eastern European countries, some of the former republics of the Soviet Union, is something that he calls the worst disaster that's happened to Russia in a century. And of course, we in the West are worried about the fraying of democracy with the rise of populist movements of the left and right everywhere. From his point of view, he feels democracy is still threatening him, be it in Belarus, where he had to help put down demonstrations, be it with the West-leaning leaders in some of the stans, or most recently in Kazakhstan. So you put all this together, you have a president that saw an opportunity and thought he could reduce the threats that he perceives.
You know, you mentioned NATO, and I do want to get into that in just a moment, but I want to talk about these sanctions, especially as they've developed over the weekend. You know, the goal is to really cripple Russia's economy. Do you think that they are working, that in effect, these sanctions and some of these private companies pulling out of investments is crippling the Russian economy?
Absolutely. These are the most comprehensive and major sanctions taken against the major country since the collapse of the Soviet Union. They are now approaching in severity what we saw in Iran. Not quite there yet, but almost there. So absolutely, they're meant to significantly weaken and destabilize the Russian economy. Just to put the impact in context for you, back in 2014-15, when some sanctions were put in place after the Russians annexed Crimea, and towards the end of that period, Russia was facing a significant cratering in oil prices. We saw about a 5% shift in the GDP of Russia. Back then, the IMF had a few studies that suggested severe sanctions could have an impact of up to 10%. So that's the sort of order of magnitude we're working with if these sanctions persist for any length of time.
And what are some of the ramifications, the longer term ramifications of this kind of economic instability in the country?
Well, I mean, when in terms of the current situation there, this can only go four ways. Either these negotiations lead to a climb down and the negotiations work, Putin's backs down, Putin's forced out, or Putin escalates. We obviously think our base case by far is continued escalation. But to the point of your question, there is a possibility, albeit small, that with this effort, and with the economic weakness that is to come, Putin is putting his own power base under threat. We see now the oligarchs that around him that have been able to benefit from and help him maintain power are being sanctioned, not just themselves, their families, their possessions. So there is a possibility of, in the longer term, him some sort of palace coup or a grassroots effort. But we do indeed think, in fairness, those are relatively low probability events, given his control over Russia and all of the media in the country.
Let's go back to NATO. Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty says that if you attack any member of NATO, you've attacked them all. Now, Ukraine isn't a part of NATO, but many of its neighbors are. Is that of concern to you? And when you're talking about escalation, are you concerned about this? And what might this mean for a broader war across Europe?
Big picture, we were trying to think through when this period that we're about to face, where the corollary is. I, as a teenager, grew up in the 70s and in college in the 80s, still with a nuclear annihilation threat hanging over us. But really, you have to go back to somewhere between 1962 and 72 before détente to find a comparison of the geopolitical environment that we're about to head into. So absolutely, it worries us. And, we have to start thinking again, as we did 30 years ago, of the small possibility that things get significantly out of control. But in terms of the Article 5 question, I'd say the countries and the regions most at threat are not in NATO. We're talking about other CIS countries, the Commonwealth of Independent States, the other 12 out of the 15 former Soviet republics. Anywhere you see significant Russian populations or influence, I think they are under threat. Or where Putin has historically had issues with. So Moldova, Georgia, parts of Kazakhstan, there's a lot to worry about. In terms of NATO, Baltics would be the place you'd worry about the most, but you already have seen, even before these actions, US and NATO starting to preposition forces to try to deter any action like that. And despite the recent moves by President Putin, which are quite alarming, like raising the nuclear readiness status of Russian forces, we do not see that as a meaningful probability. Although if we're going back to a Cold War nuclear deterrence era, you have to start pricing in some small probability of that.
Do you not see it as a nuclear possibility, because it's kind of a world of where if everyone has nuclear arms, then kind of no one has nuclear arms? Or why don't you see that as a possibility?
Well, because it's quite an effective deterrent, as we experienced since after World War II. Some have asked the question of whether Ukraine made a mistake giving up its nuclear weapons. I got to tell you, I was investing in Ukraine and Russia in the 90s. You would not have wanted Ukraine of that era, barely a political entity, massively rife with corruption, selling everything that moved on the ground, factories, assets, military hardware. You would not have wanted that sort of country to be a nuclear country. So good idea for that deterrent not to be there for Ukraine, and obviously a huge tragedy for the people there. But from a global perspective, that is an effective deterrent And let's not forget, Russia's economy when this crisis started was the size of Texas. This with the depreciation and with the sort of economic impact we're talking about, it's probably headed towards Tennessee. So we're talking about an economy that cannot sustain long-term confrontation.
You know, over the weekend, we saw shares in some cybersecurity companies really skyrocket as people are bracing for some malware attacks. What do folks at home need to be concerned about or be thinking about, or business owners?
Well, I think the markets are right in this case. You know, as I mentioned earlier, the sanctions that we are now seeing being rolled out by US and Europe, and you know, we can have another conversation on the amazing turnaround in Europe. They are akin to almost approaching what was put in place in Iran. Let's not forget why the US and its allies did those sanctions to Iran. It was to force it to capitulate, and if not, cause economic instability or regime change in Iran. If President Putin makes the same conclusions about these set of sanctions, you bet he's going to retaliate. And one of the easiest ways, asymmetric ways of retaliation is resorting to cyber warfare against critical infrastructure. So I know that the authorities in the US and Europe are already on watch for this. And if that starts, as we saw in Ukraine post around 2014, it's hard to contain. There's lots of unforeseen circumstances from those interventions, as well as the heightened risk of copycat attacks, as we're already seeing with Anonymous's attacks reportedly on some of the Soviet, sorry, Freudian slip, some of the Russian media outlets.
I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about China and Taiwan of all places. You know, how does Russia's aggression towards Ukraine kind of potentially set the stage for China's relationship with Taiwan, and what might that mean for potential conflict in the East and how this is going to spread? Is this a concern we should be concerned about? Is this a risk that we're not paying attention to, for example?
Okay, I'll try to answer that in a shorter time period than the answer is no. If you want a number, we'd say 5% chance. That's not higher than it was before this. And the reason for it is that waiting to resolve the Taiwan conflict works in favor of China. The more time passes, the balance of military power in Asia goes in their direction. Right now, there's a big increase in U.S. political action towards China, so the risks for them would be higher. And U.S. and Taiwan remain very aware of Chinese red lines, like abandoning the one China policy, and they're very careful not to do that. So we don't see that as a meaningful risk.
Mazia, before I let you go, just what is something that's really keeping you up at night in regards to this conflict?
You know, both in my career as an investor and in this seat, I've spent a lot of time looking back at episodes of geopolitical risk to see which ones are the ones that metastasize and have a sustained impact on macro markets. And what I see here makes me worried that all the elements are in place. We have typically these episodes, which are very few, have a few things in common. They involve the U.S., they involve restrictions to oil supply, the ability of policymakers in the West to offset it is limited, and they happen in the context of macroeconomic instability and weakness. Think 1973, 74 oil embargo and subsequent crisis and stagflation, and the Nixon resignation thrown in there. That's a perfect example. Well, in this case, U.S. is involved. We're talking about oil and energy supply constraints. Ability to offset it directly is low, and it's happening in the wake of the pandemic and rising inflation globally. So it worries me quite a lot. More immediately, my concerns are more about how it could metastasize into higher inflation for longer, unanchoring global inflationary expectations, which your users, I'm sure, know the pernicious effects that'll have. And I know you have right after me a speaker lined up to talk about the energy impact. So I'll cut it short.
Mazia, really appreciate you making the time. I know that everyone there at the Eurasia group is busy. So thank you for spending time here on LinkedIn News Live.
My pleasure. Take care.
That was Maziar Minovi, CEO of Eurasia Group. And joining me now to unpack what this means for the energy sector and commodities in general is Gordon Johnson. He is founder and CEO of GLJ Research with over 15 years of expertise in oil, gas, solar, and nuclear capabilities. Gordon, welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Good to have you on again.
Thank you.
You know, we were just talking about sanctions with Maziar. The Western sanctions haven't actually been targeted against Russia's oil and gas, which is its main moneymaker. Why is that?
Yeah, so if you think about it, I just want to give a statistic. It's pretty amazing. If you go back to 2008, when oil prices went from the mid double digits, $50 to roughly 140, Russia then took Georgia, right? Oil prices dipped down. Go to 2014, oil prices back at roughly 120. Russia takes Crimea. Now, oil prices dipped down, actually went negative, back at 100. Russia is attempting to take the Ukraine. So the point is, the lifeblood of Russia's economy is oil. It's not sanctions on yachts. It's not sanctions on Gucci bags. It's oil. Roughly 40% of the EU's oil comes from Russia. That number will increase significantly if Nord Stream 2 is opened up. Roughly 30% of the U.S.'s oil comes from Russia. I'm sorry, natural gas comes from Russia. And roughly 7% of our oil comes from Russia. I'm sorry, the number on the EU was 40% of the natural gas, 30% of oil into the EU comes from Russia. 30% of the U.S. is natural gas from Russia. So to your question, why aren't we hitting them where it hurts? Oil, natural gas. I think the reason is because, number one, I think U.S. and European politicians initially were very afraid of the effect it would have on stock markets and commodity markets. And secondly, due to that, we're in an election year in the U.S. and there's elections coming up in the EU. I don't think that either of those two superpowers want to destabilize, if you will, confidence in the people that are running for election. So they don't want people to pay significantly higher energy prices. I think that's a very weak reason. Even the sanctions that were announced today in the U.S., they said we're excluding, from the SWIFT system announcement, some of the energy transactions with Russia. But I think those are the reasons why the U.S. and the European Union have not been as strong as I think some would expect them to be.
Well, oil prices are continuing to climb. Should we expect them to continue to climb? Might they taper out after Wednesday's OPEC meeting? What are your thoughts? Should we be hoarding our cash to buy gas for our cars?
Yeah, that's a good question. So let's take a step back, right? Let's look at the overall oil dynamic. To answer your question very specifically, we think oil prices are going up. Our projection for oil prices 6 months in running has been that we're going to hit roughly 150 in the first half of 2022, and we're going to stay there for a while before oil prices come back down. Let me explain why, very simplistically. This isn't a Ukraine issue, right? Oil prices were negative. They went all the way to 100 before Putin invaded the Ukraine. Three things. Number one, if you look at investment in the E&P sector, basically what you need in the U.S. to basically pump and produce oil, investment has collapsed since 2015. We're down roughly 3 times from 2015 to today. Essentially, these companies aren't investing in CapEx. The question is why? The answer is simple. Number one, politicians and large investment houses alike have demonized investing in oil. If you invest in oil and gas, if you're building new coal plants or natural gas plants, you're evil. So investment in that space has declined significantly as a result of that reason. Another reason has been that there's been this big push for solar and wind, and that thus a lot of the money, the incremental money that's been invested, has diverted the oil space and went into solar and wind. The problem is solar and wind are intermittent peak load power that costs a lot more than oil and natural gas. So that's why energy costs are soaring, and solar is unreliable, whereas natural gas and coal are very reliable and cheaper. So that's why your energy independence in the U.S., right, under Trump, since for the first time since 1946, I think, we were energy independent in 2019. We're no longer energy independent because Biden essentially came in and cut the ability to basically process a lot of oil. I think that's the reason why you've had this mass underinvestment. And because
Gordon,
of that underinvestment,
you just like perfectly answered a question that I had for you, which was, could one argue that this is a great reason to pull back our fossil fuel dependency? And you would say no.
No, I think if we pull back our fossil fuel dependency, that's a national security risk because, again, the solar and the wind that I think that the focus of maybe the left is right now, it's not reliable energy. But one other thing, right? So you had $11 trillion pumped into the U.S. economy over a matter of 22 months. I think a lot of that was unnecessary. So you created this massive demand for oil, whereas you don't have the supply due to the underinvestment, and thus prices are going up. I think that a lot of politicians are going to try to blame it on the Ukraine, but I think it's a much more fundamental dynamic.
Let's look at Europe. Europe is really, as you'd mentioned some of the numbers earlier, super dependent on Russian oil and gas. What will this conflict do, for example, to global inflation and even the economies of some of those European countries?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I think that, inflation is going to continue higher. And the reason primarily is because central banks are pumping billions of dollars into the economy every single day. So when you pump billions of dollars in, you create inorganic demand, and you have a supply chain that number one it's not just the U.S. that's had massive underinvestment in oil and natural gas production. It's the entire globe. So when you have massive underinvestment, thus less supply, you have massive demand being created inorganically by central banks, you're going to get higher prices of everything, not just oil. We're talking everything from steel to wheat to pretty much everything across the board. I just want to put this in context, right? For the past basically 6 months, right, the Fed has admitted that they're transitory, right? This inflation is transitory. They've admitted that is wrong. Yet just last week on Friday, the Fed pumped an additional roughly $60 billion on a monthly basis, on that, taking that day and looking at it on a monthly basis of QE into the system with interest rates at 0 and CPI inflation at 7.5%. This is nuts what they're doing. They've created the biggest wealth inequality we've ever seen. It started with Greenspan in 1990 with MMT policy, modern monetary theory policy. You've seen a massive explosion in the wealth inequality gap. And the real driver of inflation is not the Ukraine or even supply chains. It's literally central banks creating billions of dollars of new money every day and pumping it into the system. It's not benefiting the masses. It's not benefiting the poor. It's benefiting the 1%. And I think that's the real problem. So we expect inflation to be with us for a while. We expect it to continue going higher. Surprise to the upside.
What about other commodities that we should be concerned about? Steel and iron, for example, we get some of that out of the Ukraine-Russia region.
Right. Yeah. That's so pig iron is a major import from the Ukraine and Russia. And pig iron goes into making steel in the electric arc furnace process, not the blast furnace process. That's neither here or there. The point is you're going to have less pig iron into the U.S., which means costs are going to go up, which means steel prices are going to go up. We expect that. Keep in mind, Russia and the Ukraine are also 29% of the world's wheat imports and 75% of the world's sunflower oil imports. So, even though these are just two commodities, wheat goes into a lot of other foods that is going to drive up the cost of everything. So again, does
the U.S. get a lot of wheat from Russia? I thought that was mainly Europe.
Yeah, so
Germany, for example.
Globally, the Ukraine and Russia together supply the world with 29% of their wheat imports. So even if it's not direct, I don't know the number specific to the U.S., but even if it's not direct, there's going to be an indirect impact on the inflation dynamic. But again, I think this is a great conversation to have specifically about the Ukraine, but I want to educate your viewers to what's really driving inflation. And again, it's the Fed. One quick statistic on the Fed. And when we had the global, the Great Depression, retail sales collapsed. It took 10 years for retail sales to get back to trend. So theoretically, you needed inflation over years. Global financial crisis, 2008. It took 6 years for retail sales, once they collapsed, to get back to trend. So you needed years of support. At the height of the global financial crisis, Ben Bernanke was pumping about $85 billion of stimulus in per month. COVID crisis. retail sales collapsed. It only took 6 months to get back to trend. So we're talking about before November of 2020, the Fed should have completely stepped out. Again, just last week, they did the equivalent of $60 billion a month of QE when Ben Bernanke was doing $85 billion at the height of the global financial crisis. We're not in a global financial crisis. So when you pump too much money in, you create too much demand, more demand following, less supply equals higher prices of everything.
So let's bring it back to the Russia-Ukraine crisis and its impact here for the U.S. and the greater global economy. Is there anything that really you're concerned about that you feel like people aren't talking about and they should be?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the biggest concern I have would be failed policy mistakes. For instance, one of the biggest drivers of the increase in energy costs in California and Texas have been, again, a move away from fossil fuel and a move towards renewables, a move away from distributed baseload power and a move towards intermittent peak load power. And you've seen, like, for instance, the past 10 years, the cost of electricity in California up 9 times more than the U.S. average. Texas, you're having blackouts and brownouts because when you need the energy, it's not there. So I think a big concern of mine, and it's not a near term, but I think it's more a 2 to 3 year down the line, we push more towards these intermittent, unreliable peak load power sources like wind and solar. And we do more of that in states, and we decommission more of our nuclear plants. We move away from natural gas. We move away from clean coal. And if we do that, I think we become less energy independent. And I think it becomes a national security risk as we need all this power from other countries when we have it right under the ground we're sitting on right now.
Gordon, unfortunately, we have to leave it there. We're out of time, but thanks for coming on and sharing your expertise with us today.
Absolutely. Thank you.
That was Gordon Johnson, CEO of GLJ Research. And you can continue the conversation here on the stream, or if you want to check out some of our other cool stories, you can look on the right or click into the search box if you're on mobile. Thank you so much for watching. This has been LinkedIn News Live. I'm Nina Melendez.